Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the parallel session on food security. My name is Mary Kawar. I will be chairing, and then I will also be commenting on the two papers, okay? We have a very exciting afternoon with two very different papers. One by Abdelhadi Benghalem on internet and food production using panel data evidence from North African country. And another one by Shireen Alazzawi on distributional impact of the Russia-Ukrainian crisis, the case of Egypt. Okay. So we all know that food security is one of the most pressing issues facing us in the world and the Arab region as well. We have population growth, we have climate crisis, we have political crisis, we have water challenges, and we are having increasing challenges to find food security for Arab population. We do know that zero hunger is one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and is defined as the objective to ensure that everyone has access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food that meet dietary needs and meet preferences. And this is an important issue in the discussions we will have, that people have their own preferences. So some of the key factors that contribute to food insecurity in the Arab region include poverty, conflict, climate change, water scarcity, food price volatility, and most recently this was compounded more by the COVID-19 crisis and the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. So we have one paper that will focus on North Africa and look at the potential of internet utilization and access to electricity in improving food availability and accessibility. And another one that focuses on Egypt. The first one focuses on North Africa. The second one focuses on Egypt in terms of how the Russian-Ukrainian crisis affected basic food commodity prices and the implication of this for social welfare and social protection. On a practical note, we will start with the paper by Dr. Abdelhadi Benghalem on North Africa. And the paper is co-written with Dr. Abdelhadi, with Samir, Maliki, and Ouieme Sur. But he happens to be with us today, so I will only introduce him. Okay. So Dr. Abdelhadi holds a PhD in economic engineering and enterprise from the Faculty of Economics and Management at the University of Abu Bakr Bil Khalid Tlemcen. Bilqaim. Currently, he serves as an assistant professor at the Oran Graduate School of Economics in Algeria. He is also a research associate with the Economic Research Forum and an expert with the European Foundation of Training on a project focusing on digitalization and the labor market in the MENA region. In addition, Dr. Abdelhadi specializes in data science, econometrics, macro and microeconomic theories and applications. So Dr. Abdelhadi, you have 15 minutes.
Hello everyone, this is Benghalem Abdelhadi from Oran Graduate School of Economics, Algeria, and I'm very pleased to be part of this conference. It's my pleasure today to discuss with you the critical issue of food production in North African countries. As we all know, the region has faced several challenges from conflict to the ongoing pandemic. These challenges have had a profound impact on food industry, putting it at risk of food insecurity. In response, we need to focus on resource-efficient food production. And one solution or potential solution may lies in the internet utilization. In this work, I will present an empirical study examining the impact of the excess of internet and access to electricity and food import variable on the food production. To do so, a theoretical background and hypothesis are presented in section 2. Section 3 will present data examination and methodology. Section 4 will discuss the results and will conclude with some policy implications in section 5. Based on our comprehensive literature review, it is evident that the internet utilization has had a significant impact on food production. One of the notable benefits is its it is perceived as an educational tool and a source of food production knowledge. The vast availability of information can help food producers and farmers to get the information about the field they're working on and upgrade their skills, which can lead to boost their productivity. Based on the related literature review, it is clear that the import of food can harm domestic food production. This can be or one of the major adverse effects of importing food on domestic food production is importing food can conquer domestic food production, which can lead to a decline the demand for locally produced food, which can lead also to the decrease in the price of domestic food products. This can further discourage food producers from continuing their activities. As a result, the labor food market can become skewed as many food producers leave their jobs or switch their jobs for this situation. Also, based on the literature review, we have found that access to electricity is a prerequisite for access to the internet, as many devices require internet for functioning. So improving the access of electricity can result in improved access to the internet and its benefits on food production. The literature have found that the access of electricity has a positive impact on food production. With the advance of ICTs, farmers can access to information on new techniques, farming techniques, weather forecast, and market prices, which can lead to boost their productivity. Also, access to electricity enable food transformation and storage, and can supply mechanical power, which is an essential element in food production process. So after reviewing the literature review, we have found that limited attention has been paid to the relationship between internet and food production, and the purpose of this research is to examine these relationships. To do so, or to accomplish this goal, a RDL panel data model is applied. The empirical section employs a time series or annual time series data during the period 2000-2022 from 4 North African countries: Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco. Our variables of interest are food production index as a dependence variable. We have the access to internet represented in individuals using the internet, the percentage, as an independence variable. Also, we have employed an explanatory variable, which is access to internet, due to its importance in both food security or food production and the internet. The model also employs food imports to clarify the risk of food imports on food production and local food producers. The unit root test has found that the 3 variables, food production index, internet usage, and electricity, are not stationary at level. However, they are all stationary at the first difference. On the other hand, both tests have found that food import variable are stationary at level, which lead us to conclude that our variable are of mixed integrated level. And following Pisaran and Shin, we believe that the best model here to use is the panel RDL. To ensure the accuracy of our examination, a VIF test, which is a variance inflation factor, has been applied to detect any multicollinearity between the independent variable. The VIF value were found to be less than 5, meaning that we don't have a severe correlation between our independent variables. The outcome calculated orientation depends more on the PMG, pooled mean group, where the Hlasny test has confirmed its reliability over the MG and DFE. So here, the ECM, the ECM is negative and significant at 5%, meaning that our variables can be related in the long term. There is or there exists a long-term conjugation between the variables. The PMG have found that the internet usage has a positive significant effect on food production in both short and long term, meaning that food production can be enhanced by increasing internet usage and access to electricity. However, food imports displays a negative significant effect on food production in long term, and it remains insignificant in short term, meaning that food production can be enhanced by reducing food imports. The first one is the error correction term. Its significance lead us to conclude that the variables have a long-term configuration. Now as a conclusion, the study have found that the internet utilization and access to electricity are vital factors for food production, as they help food producers to access to the information, upgrade their skills, and boost their productivity. However, the study has found that importing food harm food production in North African countries, which creates the necessity to countries to move forward self-sufficiency food production. Our study proposed to use the internet in the food industry by sensitizing local food producers to its importance as a source of knowledge on new techniques, and also to adopt the Internet of Things as a strategy to maximize resource efficiency and enhance food security. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdelhadi. You showed us the significance of being efficient and effective in food production, and the prerequisites for that, which is internet and electricity availability. Thank you so much. Now we move to our second paper, which is by Dr. Shireen Alazzawi, with the title Distributional Impacts of the Russia-Ukraine Crisis and the Case of Egypt. Dr. Shireen is a lecturer in the Economics Department, Levy School of Business at Santa Clara University, and a research fellow at the ERF. Currently, she is also working with UNDP Regional Office for Arab States as a labor economist. Her research focus is on poverty and inequality, labor economics, international trade, with special emphasis always on the Middle East and North Africa. And she has a body of published work. She had received a PhD in economics from the University of California, Davis, and has a master's degree from Stanford and the American University in Cairo. Dr. Shireen, the floor is yours. You have around 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. By the end of the year, it was still very much manageable, under 10% compared to the previous year. Things changed very quickly with the start of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. As we can see from the graph, food prices shot up almost immediately. And of course, at the same time, the average inflation rate also dramatically increased. By the end of 2022, food prices had increased by 38% compared to a year before, and overall inflation had increased by 20%. So very dramatic, very high compared to the previous few years, and even to the previous episode of high inflation that occurred right after the 2016 devaluation. The presenter is not working anymore. Check, please. Okay, thank you. Of course, this is a reflection of the huge increase in global food prices, which actually started going up at the end of 2021. We can see that the food price index was already going up at the end of 2021, and of course the cereals index. However, at the height of the crisis, the international crisis in May, it was actually beyond what it had reached even in the all-time previous high of 2008. So things were very dramatic internationally until May. However, as we can see from the graph, international food prices did start to go down, and while still not normal by any means, they are definitely not as high as they were last May. Egypt, of course, is the largest importer of wheat in the world, importing up to 13 million tons of wheat annually, 2/3 of which was sourced from Russia and Ukraine directly. Bread is a major component in Egyptians' diets. It makes up almost 40% of caloric intake, and imports are a major source of wheat in Egypt, almost 60%. Of course, Egypt already has a huge malnutrition problem, as evidenced by high rates of stunting among children, and so obviously this is a major food security issue and something that needs to be very closely monitored. An important fact is that, according to a recent World Bank report, the inflation rate in Egypt was actually a lot higher than the rest of the region. And this study came out a few months ago, so it only had data until July 2022. But since then, the rest of the region has also witnessed a dramatic decline in inflation, while Egypt's inflation has continued to go up. If we look at the consumer price index for Egypt, there is actually also quite an important regional disparity. If we look to the graph on my right, rural versus urban, there's quite a big difference between rural overall consumer price index and urban. And if we look at particular items within the consumer price index, we see that the food price index rose quite dramatically immediately after the onset of the crisis. Energy prices were for a while stable, but then they also started to rise. Now, importantly, people's consumption baskets will differ. We expect that people at the lower end of the income distribution will spend a lot more on food, while people at the higher end of the income distribution will spend more on energy. And in fact, our data does confirm that. Let me just jump ahead to that slide right now. We see that across regions, consumption on food is over 30%, and in some cases up to 40% of the average annual consumption. Consumption on transport and fuels is very low at lower end of the distribution and rises quite a bit at the higher end, especially in urban Egypt. So all of this means that the impact of the crisis will differ across regions, sorry, and so that's exactly what we intend to study in this paper. The disparities by income levels and by region in the impact of this crisis on Egyptians' well-being. And of course, Egyptian poverty rates were already high and rising, and so that's something to keep in mind as we are studying the impact of this crisis on welfare. So to be very specific, the paper will look at several important questions. How much of the international increase in commodity prices passed through to domestic prices? What implications did this have on cost of living? Did these cost of living impacts change compared to how we measure the cost of living? If we look at substitution effects, for example, does the impact change? And then how do they change by region and by income levels? The first part of our analysis involved calculating the pass-through effect to domestic prices, and we use a model that's commonly used in exchange rate pass-through estimations. I won't go through it in a lot of detail in the interest of time. We develop a model based on, or that makes prices in a given region, in a given month, a function of a tradable and non-tradable component. We also include exchange rates of Egypt's most important trading partners, and we calculate a reduced form equation that allows us to see the impact of the international price increases on domestic prices. In the next stage, we estimate the increase in the cost of living across different groups in the distribution using these passed-through price changes. Now, the consumer price index, as is well known, does not take into consideration substitution effects. When prices rise, people will resort to substitution. They will change their consumption bundle to try to stay at the same welfare level. Sometimes they will reduce their consumption of certain items just to be able to consume things like paying for an internet bill or a cell phone bill, for example. So habit formation is also an important part of the decision-making process of households. And so in our analysis, we have developed a method to calculate changes in the cost of attaining a given utility level rather than a given fixed consumption basket. We follow a method derived by Baseman and his co-authors based on the GFT utility function, which after a lot of derivations gives us a true cost of living index that is based on fixed preferences but not a fixed bundle. This is a relatively readily, easily available set of data that we can calculate, prices in the base period and current period, and consumption bundles in the base period and the current period. Another cost of living index is based on changes in preferences. However, we didn't have the data at the time that we conducted this analysis. And this change of preferences cost of living index, we assume that preferences change over time, not just the fixed preferences and prices. So I'm going to be presenting results based on the first cost of living index, and in the next round of revisions, we are working on this second cost of living index. So very briefly, cost of living index is going to give us the compensating variation. So when prices change, so for example, when the income, when the price of good X rises, we would expect that the budget constraint would pivot, and this would lead the consumer to be on a lower utility function. The compensating variation idea is to figure out how much money is needed to retain the original utility level, to push the consumer back up towards the original utility level so that they are able to stay at the same level of satisfaction. We use data from the Central Bank of Egypt and Egypt's most important trading partners for the international commodity prices. We use consumer price index data and household budget survey data from CAPMAS. And we are basing this current analysis on the 2017-2018 household income, expenditure, and consumption survey. Just another case in point, even within the major consumption bundles, we can see that there's a lot of variation between the lowest income quintiles or deciles and the highest income deciles in terms of the consumption of some of the basic commodities such as vegetables, cereals, sugar, and oil. There's a clear reduction in the share of these items as households become richer, and the difference is much larger for urban households. Jumping straight to the results, we see that cost of living increases were quite different across regions. I first present results based on our own calculation of a simple fixed basket less pairs price index just for comparison purposes. And already we can see in these results that there's quite a big disparity between the households at the top or the top decile and households at the bottom decile. And the gap is even bigger in terms of urban households. This calculation doesn't take substitutions into consideration. On the right-hand side, we do take substitutions into consideration, and in that case, we also see this dramatic difference or large difference between urban and rural households. If we compare the poorest rural household to the richest urban household, the gap is quite large, over 4 or 5% per year over the course of 2022. So to summarize the results, we do see that there are large disparities across regions and by income levels. Until May of 2022, when the international food price rises were the fastest, the median household in rural areas endured almost 2 percentage points higher inflation compared to the median household in urban areas. And households in the bottom decile in each region faced 2 percentage points higher inflation than households in the top decile in the same region. Rural households at the bottom decile saw their income, their cost of living rise by almost 12%, while that of the top decile was just under 10%. If we look at the whole year overall for 2022, the richest household in urban areas faced just 18% inflation. It's not insignificant, of course, while the poorest household was almost 22%. In rural areas, the gap was slightly less, but still quite significant. Comparing the richest urban household to the poorest rural household, the gap was over 4%. So quite a large disparity in cost of living increases. The final thing that I want to present is the level of compensating variation. So if we were to compensate the households who lost their welfare as a result of the price increases, by how much would that differ across regions and across household levels? And one interesting takeaway from this graph, so already we have talked about how the poorest rural households were the hardest hit compared to the richest urban household. But one interesting takeaway from this analysis is that the median rural and the median urban households actually caught up to the poorest income levels in both regions sometime around the summer of 2022. So they caught up, unfortunately, in a bad way. Their income declined in the same amount as the poorest quintiles. So in conclusion, the crisis had a profound impact on inflation in Egypt. This inflation was not uniform across the distribution. People in rural areas were harder hit. People at the lower income of the distribution were harder hit. And the compensating variation required clearly shows that they need to be compensated. Almost 20 or 25% of their income was lost, or their expenditure was lost as a result of this crisis. In terms of extensions that we are working on right now, we are looking at how this affects poverty rates. We're also investigating whether we can see similar disparities by by gender, by employment status, by education level of household. We are now also working on harmonizing and translating the 2019-2020 data set, the household income and expenditure survey data set, to be able to use it to calculate the changing preference cost of living index. And finally, we are working on adding Tunisia, where we just received the data for Tunisia, and we are working on adding that as a way to compare the two. And finally, in terms of policy implications, obviously, I think that there's a clear policy implication. We need to help support these people who have lost a large percentage of their income. There needs to be a very well-targeted mechanism to reach them. Of course, there are already programs in Egypt that could be extended and could use this kind of targeting analysis to help those who were hurt the most. And of course, building on the presentation that we had earlier, it's very important that Arab countries as a whole develop a strategy for less dependence on imports, because when a crisis like this happens, obviously it can have severe implications. Not only will it reduce dependence, but it can also create jobs and create a whole mechanism of growth and development. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, we have, now I'm supposed to do a 10-minute commentary. I switched from being a chair to commentary. So I'll make it short so that we start the discussion. Okay, but I need to sit down. I'll get a chair there. Thank you so much, Dr. Shireen, for... Thank you so much, Dr. Shireen and Dr. Abdelhadi for these two complementary papers. And it is actually, they flow so well from the morning discussion where we talked about climate issues and food security and also conflict, which is also related to this. So allow me just a few commentaries. And then we can open for discussion. I do think that these two papers are valuable in advancing the knowledge needed to identify the policy responses for the critical and pressing issue of food security. And I don't know if it was me, because I was asked to comment on these two papers, but when I started looking at the literature, I saw what a pressing issue and where have I been in not knowing all this information. So thank you for your contributions. I do believe also that food security issue is complex, multi-layered, and which requires a multiplicity of policy responses. It's about water and energy and trade and regional and international cooperation, logistics, infrastructure, changing consumption, health, skills, jobs, and of course, IT, internet, electricity, etc. So it is complex. It's not a straightforward issues. And I think it's directly related to stability in the Arab countries. We know that protests of Arab citizens are there when food subsidies are removed. Though it is well established that we have subsidies that are usually not very pro-poor, you know, when the whole population gets bread subsidy or electricity subsidy, but if you try to remove it, then we have a crisis. And we are also a region prone to conflicts. And I do think that some of the underlying reasons for conflicts is usually food insecurity. There has been analysis in Syria before the crisis erupted, that the crisis erupted in Syria because there were several years of drought before that were not addressed by the government, and people were food insecure. So this issue is quite heavy and serious. So before I address the two papers, I found a report that is recently published by the UN in 2022 that brings these numbers. So in Middle East and North Africa today, an estimated 53.9, so 54 million people suffered from severe food insecurity in the Arab region in 2021. I mean, 54 million. This accounts for 55% increase since 2010. So you will find this report online. It's FAO, IFAD, WFP, WHO, UNICEF, and ESCWA. So also moderate or severe food insecurity also has been an upward trend affecting 154 million people in 2021. And an increase in 12 million, so in 1 year, those who are moderately insecure, there was an increase in 1 year by 12 million. The same report reveals that more than half of the population of the Arab states, or 162 million, could not afford a healthy diet in 2020. So given the state of affairs, the report highlights the we are unlikely to achieve zero hunger SDG 2 by 2030. And they go in looking into the challenges which both of you, Dr. Shireen and Abdelhadi, had explained very eloquently. Now, going back to the paper, I see a great complementarity, because one paper actually is about the production sphere. It's about IT, electricity, improved food productivity, agribusiness, trade, etc. And the other one is the household sphere, which is cost of living, welfare, impact of inflation on families. And that complementarity, both are fundamental building blocks for approaching government policy. So this is very important and timely for policy discussion. And here I would like to focus on the two papers. So on the paper on Egypt, there's a conclusion that since poorer households were disproportionately more affected by inflation and rising food prices, the Egyptian government should recommend to strengthen social protection, basically labor market protection and social insurance. So the institutional constraint here is that social protection policy and the need for social stability. So I think this is a very well taken conclusion, but the thing is, we knew this. We knew this before the two crises hit, which is COVID and the Ukraine crisis. So it will be useful to know why this has not been done before, and I'm sure it's on your mind. So Egypt has undergone profound economic and social and political transformation since 2011, and poverty has been on the rise. So the need to address the shortcomings of the current system has been on the table for quite some time. So the question is, how come we are still in the same place, and when we get a crisis, those who are most vulnerable get most affected? So that, just to address this. So why, with all the former and current efforts, we can still face this problem? Moving to the second paper, I see here that domestic food production patterns and the efficacy of internet and electricity availability for augmenting it. I mean, you are spot on in what needs to be done for having more food security. And you demonstrate very well internet utilization and access to electricity as vital drivers for long-term food production. In fact, we are living in an age where internet is now part of human rights. And earlier this morning, one of the panelists suggested that in terms of subsidies, we move from, I think, energy subsidy to internet subsidy, which was very interesting. But one conclusion of the report is about food sufficiency. And here I think we can argue differently. I hope when we talk about food self-sufficiency, we are not talking about restrictions, trade restrictions, or imports from international markets that could be of lower prices, where poor families will benefit from. And in my view, the issue is not whether we have food self-sufficiency or we don't have food self-sufficiency. It's just a range of coordinated national policies that needs to be done. Agriculture, water, energy, trade, transport, logistics. And what is needed is to strike a balance between national production and imports from diversified sources from both for the short-term perspective and for the long-term perspective. So I feel if you can just nuance it in the conclusion. I think also in today's integrated globalized world, the issue of self-sufficiency should be cast within a broader concept of food security and as part of larger social policies and efforts to alleviate hunger and poverty. For example, unsurprisingly, just because, and I think this would benefit your paper because you mentioned it a lot, food security is at the heart of WTO members' negotiations on agriculture. And progress in this area could lead to significant improvements on how markets for food and agriculture function by helping to correct and prevent the restrictions and distortions in world trade. This might be adding too much for a very specific question that you asked, but it is, food happens to be at the heart of international world trade negotiations. Moreover, the UN report I just quoted in the beginning identifies trade as an enabler of food security and nutrition. And it is clear that countries are no longer able to locally produce the quantities needed due to limited natural resources or food preferences, and therefore there is still a very important role for trade and trade facilitation. If I take the example of my country, Jordan, there is no way they can have food sufficiency with the availability of land, the stress on water, and the population. And even if there is food sufficiency, they might be able to grow things that people don't consume anymore. So there is no way, for example, that Lebanon or Jordan, small countries, will have wheat. So I think the issue of international trade and having a fair system is a very important issue here. So in conclusion, I would like to congratulate you again for both your papers. And I would also like to call on the ERF, who is from the ERF here, that this is an extremely important issue and that a program can be developed around it in the future because it has a multiple level from international cooperation to local production to agricultural policy to a whole range of policies that would be very interesting to look at in the Arab region. Thank you very much. Okay. So, with these comments, now we are open for a discussion, and I would like to ask Dr. Omar to start.
Very interesting papers. I'm sorry I got a bit late for the first one. I realize my questions are, these are not part of the papers that you were writing, but I'm very interested in the policy implications of that. So for the first paper, my question is, and this is always the challenge in the agricultural sector, is how do you get to farmers? How do you, there are certain, maybe electricity is something you do on a regional level, but how do you train, how do you give equipment, this has always been a challenge. And my question is, have you, and I realize this is outside the scope of the paper, but have you noticed any difference between first, I assume large farmers are more likely than small farmers, but the question on small farmers, and I don't know whether that exists, are there تعاونيات through which you felt like they had more access through تعاونيات to that kind of help as opposed to them finding that access individually? So that's the first question. The second paper is also policy oriented, and from your experience, this cost disparities that are faced within, what do you have a hypothesis as to why those cost disparities exist? Is it economies of scale? Is it delivery? You know, what part of the system that's on the local level? And I was struck by the fact that Egypt was different than other regions in that sense. Is there something again about about the supply structure that makes it harder for prices to go down? Thanks.
We'll take another question, then you can answer two questions together.
Thank you. No, very interesting and important papers, and I have one question to each author. On Dr. Abdelhadi's paper, I'm a bit puzzled. I mean, I'm not surprised that in you want me to turn around? How's the camera شوف. Okay. So I have to smile now. So for Dr. Abdelhadi's paper, I'm not surprised that you get this negative coefficient on imports. But what I'm puzzled at, the question for you, are we sure on the direction of causation? Because I would have thought that the direction of causation will go from food production to imports, and not from imports to food production. That is, when food production goes down, imports will go up to fill in the gap. So that is, and I'm a very old man. I did econometrics for my PhD, but that was 500 years ago. So maybe in the same university that you went to, actually. So that is really, that was my only puzzle. I wanted to make sure about where is the causality going. On Dr. Shireen's paper, yeah, I am not surprised by the results, but my question is really that are we only looking at a partial equilibrium approach, meaning that when food prices go up, in your case, the rural people are hurt, but rural people produce food. So they are spending more for food, but their income is also increasing. So, is there something there that you looked at? Is there increase in income, rural income, because of the higher agriculture prices, compensating at least part of the increasing cost of buying food?
Dr. Abdelhadi, you want to start? Answer both questions?
Thank you very much for these valuable questions. I will start with the first question. How do you get to farmers? Actually, it's hard to answer to this question. How do you get to farmers? Our econometric study has provided results and related it with some policy implications. We said that we have to sensitize farmers to the importance of internet. Now, this role, I think, it's on governments each country has its own policy, structures, and facilities, like the doctor mentioned, تعاونيات. So donc, I think it depends on the country strategy to how to make a road or a plan how to get to farmers. The second question, the difference between correlation and causality. Correlation doesn't mean doesn't forcibly be causality. The causality happens between two variables, just two variables, without the add of another variables. However, a correlation happens with the add of other control variables. Okay, and here what cause food import in these countries. Generally, importing food in these countries lies in political decisions. If we take some countries as an example, they can proceed food production in some type or kind of product, but they do not facilitate this operation to local producers. And this is another issue that must be discussed. Thank you very much for this question. We'll work to upgrade our research. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for both the questions. So for the first question, why the disparities at the local level? So our analysis, as you mentioned, is a partial equilibrium analysis, and we're only looking at the consumption side. So in terms of the consumption, there are differences in consumption patterns, and that's where this is coming from in our data. But you're absolutely right also that the rural areas are producers of food as well as being consumers of food. And that is something that we would need to examine using ex-post income data, and we don't have that yet. So that's something that is definitely an important question to ask and could lead to a more nuanced and a more complete picture of how the welfare effect changed or was different between the rural and the urban regions. So back to your second question, and then I'll continue to address the partial equilibrium aspect. Why is Egypt different? And that's, I think, the key of the matter, and that's why we wanted to bring in another country. We actually started trying to get the data for Jordan. We failed. We weren't able to get the data for Jordan, so we looked for Tunisia. And yeah, maybe you can help us. So now we've just got the data for Tunisia, and hopefully we'll be able to explore, is there something different? My sense, and this is based on just my understanding of the way the Egyptian market works and other studies, is that there are a lot of monopolies. And these are obviously preventing the prices from going down. As we saw in the graphs, the international prices went down, but prices in Egypt just continue to go up and up and up. So something must be going on from an economist's perspective. Immediately you would expect, I'm sorry? The exchange rate as well. That's true, but also there is also a lot more going on in Egypt than in other similar countries that are facing similar problems. So there has to be something about market distortions that's going on. Studying that, of course, is a much more difficult issue. Hopefully, if we have more readily available firm-level data, we could put our hands on that, but that's a completely different research question. But that's kind of my quick answer, just my thoughts really on the matter. Back to the partial equilibrium approach, or the partial equilibrium aspect that we bring up in the paper. You're absolutely right. Rural areas will probably or rural farmers will be seeing higher prices for some of the food items. However, there are still a lot of price controls on the part of farming. And so even if the international price rises, the government is still imposing a certain price level, and that's the price that they are buying the agricultural production from the farmer at. And so the farmer doesn't always benefit when international food prices go up. The fact that 25% of income roughly was lost for the poorest rural household is quite a staggering finding, I think. And I was also surprised myself by the fact that the median households in both rural and urban areas were caught up, and they were also as adversely affected by the end of the year. Of course, that's a combination of food and energy at the same time, and probably also the exchange rate, which are already incorporated in our methodology for the pass-through effect. But another paper that I have with Vladimir also just looks at the exchange rate pass-through from the previous episode of exchange rate devaluation in Egypt in 2016. And there we also did find a very large disparity by region and by income level. So obviously everything is related, and hopefully we'll get more data that will allow us to understand the full picture in terms of income and expenditure. But even then, I feel that it's still an important finding that we have this really large disparity by where you live and where you are along the income distribution. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Just a comment. I think everything you said is true. One thing on the policy, that's why I wanted to raise the issue of looking at the income side for the rural households. Because then my policy recommendation would be, if there are price controls, would be, I mean, it's much simpler to remove the price controls to allow people to get the right price than to give them subsidies.
Anyone else with questions? We have 15 more minutes. Bye. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. If nobody has any questions, allow me to thank the authors again for this very, very interesting paper. My methodologically tight. For thoughts. And open this area